Start with this plate. One side of this plate has 5 small dimples in it. That's where the shutter blades actually sit. That goes down on this side. The side that's facing up here should be plain, should be flat and smooth. There's just that rivet post sticking up there. And the diaphragm blades are just put in sequence. I'm just using a toothpick here to help me get those blades seated correctly. Just positioning them. When you get round to the start again, you've got to pull the blades away so that you can fit the next blade in position. Like that. Of course, it's much easier when you've only got a 5-blade diaphragm like this than the 10-blade diaphragms that you find on the earlier 3Cs or on the Retina IIIs and 1A type cameras. I'm just swinging these blades back and against the centre of my jig, and this plate goes on, and I happen to know it goes on in exactly that position, making sure that those little pivots come up through the plate. A thread of cotton here, let's blow that away. And the case goes on in only one position. That small stud that was on that plate sticks up through a hole in the back of the plate, so it's located correctly. Can't go anywhere else. That's it, give that a wriggle, that should seat. I'll lift the outside of my jig off there. I'm just having a quick look, everything appears fine. And I'll put the 3 screws in that retain that plate. I'm doing these screws up quite lightly. I need to make sure that the blades haven't moved, that they've stayed in their positions, that the pivots are all correctly positioned. And the proof of the pudding is whether this moves smoothly. And it does. I can tighten the 3 screws up. And check again. It's not as smooth as it sometimes is. I'm trying to figure out where that residual stiffness is coming from. No, I think that'll be fine. That's good. The main thing is that it's free from oil and grease, on the blades in particular. If the blades have got oil contamination on them, they'll stick together. If they're stuck together and you force the setting lever, something's got to give. And that's when blades get distorted. They'll actually get bowed up as they're pushed out of shape. Not so much in these shutters, but then certainly the others that have the pivots at either end of the blade are more likely to bow up. The other thing that can happen is that the pivots can pull out of position, and then you end up with a blade that's flapping around in the breeze, and then it can get tangled up with the position of the other ones, and then you can end up with permanent damage. But anyway, this is all good. That's a good result. That's my shutter case cleaned and ready to have the mechanism plate dealt to. And the mechanism plate is here, so I'll tip the shutter blades out. Well, I should be able to. The shutter blades, of course, should come off individually, but they come off here as a sheet because they're all stuck together with oil. And they're stuck quite strongly, as you can tell by that loud click sound as it popped apart as I'd cleaned it. These blades, I'm looking at them now, see what sort of state they're in. Some of them are oilier than others. And I'm not sure what the surface condition is like. Now the blades need to be free from oil, and they should be smooth because they've got to move over each other at high speed. So there should be no undue friction there. Sometimes you get minor surface corrosion on the blades, and that will make them rough. If they're rough, they won't want to move quickly. Now the black marks on here are mostly coming off my piece of paper. That's because I'm using a dark grey piece of tissue here to work on, because if I use my standard old white tissue, you can see very little because the contrast is too high. You just end up with black shutter blades on a white ground and you can see nothing. These blades are cleaning up quite well. And here I'm just using a toothpick to manipulate the blades around while I'm working on them, because there's no pivot on them for me to grab, unlike the diaphragm blades. But a toothpick makes a very good tool for manipulating the blades and holding them down in position while you're working on them. Those blades are good. You might notice there's a slight marking on the blade right here, a couple of parallel lines. That's where they have rubbed on something as they've opened and shut. That's by no means a serious issue. It's not like a deep scratch or anything, and that's not going to affect the way the shutter works. But here over the mechanism plate, this is quite oily. It needs to come apart. The 3 screws hold the lens tube to the mechanism plate. The brass centered tube here is called the lens tube. Screws is quite tight. 3 screws hold that in place. One of them is slightly longer than the others because it has to pass through this bracket. So it's about 1/4 millimetre longer than its mates. You might not think that sounds like an awful lot, but it makes a difference. If you put the screws in the wrong position, you'll end up with a screw that sticks out 1/4 millimetre on the other side of the plate and will catch the shutter blades. And possibly more importantly, you'll end up with a screw that's 1/4 millimetre too short for the job it's doing, which means that when you go to tighten the screw up in this nice thin aluminium mechanism plate, you are pulling on a very short piece of thread and it strips out quite easily. So make sure the screws go back in the correct position. The longer of the 3 screws goes on where that bracket goes. So these components I just need to clean up. Might as well start with the lens tube. the outside of the tube at the front here in particular, that's where our internal cocking ring, the round ring, runs, and it's also where the shutter speed setting cam plate runs at the front. At the rear of the lens tube here, this is where the blade actuating ring runs in this recess here. It's trapped between the lens tube and the mechanism plate. And typically there's grease and trapped dust in there. That's quite good, that's nice and clean. The blade actuating ring, this is the piece that swings to swing the shutter blades in and outwards to make your exposure. And this is driven by the main cam. This can be lubricated with a bit of graphite powder, or sometimes or you can lubricate it with a bit of molybdenum paste. It can be quite good too. You can see the greasy marks that are coming off there. There's sort of a yellowish brown colour to that. That's oil staining. That looks good. And the mechanism plate itself. Worth taking your time cleaning this because it's got lots of levers on it and nooks and crannies for oil to settle in and make an appearance, a reappearance later on after you think you've got everything clean. When I worked at Kodak, as I recall, it was common practice. I don't think we didn't strip the mechanism plate down like this every time. It was much more common to clean it complete with the lens tube and the blade actuating ring in place. And it was simply put into a container of naphtha and worked backwards and forwards, and then all the naphtha blown away to leave it clean and oil free. I find that I might have been maligning my ex-workmates there. It's a long time since I worked at Kodak, but that's the way I remember it. That looks good. Now to the reassembly. This diaphragm, I said it was moving reasonably smoothly, and it is, but I'm going to just put a bit of graphite powder in the edge there and work that backwards and forwards, because there appears to be a bit of friction between the settings ring here and the case. So I'm just working this in, and then I'll blow it all away and check to see if it's made an improvement. I suspect it will have done. The diaphragm really should move quite smoothly. Right, that's enough work in there. I'll go and blow that out and report back. Well, that's certainly vastly improved actually. That's really good. And all I've done there is just worked in a little bit of graphite powder and then made sure that I've blown away all the excess. There shouldn't be any loose graphite powder left in there, and it will have just left a very thin layer of graphite on surfaces that are in contact with each other, and it's reduced the friction here quite remarkably. You can possibly even tell it's much quieter as I move that now than it was previously, and I can tell you that the force required to move that is much less. So I probably didn't need to do that, but I'm happier that it's now that it's done. Anyway, back to putting the mechanism plate together. Now, I've said that you can lubricate the mechanism plate with some graphite powder or some molybdenum paste. I'm just going to use molybdenum paste here just for a change. I'm just running some on the top surface and the bottom surface, and there's almost nothing to see here. It's like just leaving a dirty mark. You need extremely small amounts of molybdenum paste to make a difference. Now I'll fit this ring in place. Just making sure the various levers are pulled back out of the way so it's not catching on anything, and I'll set the detent spring here behind its pin. It'll play the game. There we go. And this is held in place with the lens tube, which only fits on in one position. And it's held in place with 3 screws. One of the screws is longer than its mates and it goes through the bracket. And I can see immediately that this is the screw I want. If you're not routinely doing tasks like this, it might not be immediately obvious to you that one of those screws is longer than its mates. But I'm sure if you take the time to look, you'll notice. Don't go mad and do these screws up tight immediately. You need to make sure that everything is correctly positioned and you haven't got a lever trapped underneath there. That's moving smoothly. I can do those 3 screws up. I don't need to do them up as tight as the last person had them. That's moving nice and smoothly. If I put this in the blades open position, which is like that, I can put my shutter blades on now. And the shutter blades, there's my toothpick, the shutter blades start here. And are assembled in an anti-clockwise direction around the shutter. Unlike the diaphragm blades, shutter blades just simply lay in on top of each other, so there is a first position and a last position. So the blades are all in position now. I can put the shutter case in position, and this will hold it all together. This only goes on in one position. I'm just getting it lined up. And we have 3 small countersunk head screws which will hold this together. Just run those screws down lightly. Never do them up tight at this stage until you're sure that everything is seated correctly. It's possible to disturb the shutter blade while you're lifting the case over so that it's not seated correctly on its pins. There we go, that's all good. So I can tighten those 3 screws up. And that's our shutter blades, all clean and back in the case. The diaphragm blades, of course, are nice and free running now, much better than they were. And I can start assembling all the control gear for the top of the mechanism plate. Reassembling the control components for the mechanism plate now. First I'm just going to lubricate this with a bit of molybdenum paste on this detent spring here on the blade actuating ring. And there are 2 points on the blade actuating ring that couple to the main drive cam here and here. The cam opens the blades with one position, closes it on the other. So I've just lubricated those as well. But the springs are the main thing to be done here. And springs are always entertaining. So starting with this spring, fits on here. And I'm holding a toothpick over the centre of that stud so that spring can't get away. I can pick up the end of the spring with my tweezers, lift it over the obstructions and hook it behind this post on this bracket here. So these 2 levers are now spring loaded. The next spring is for the B lever. That sits on this post, if I can get it to sit there. Let's pick that up again. Fits over this post, and there's a groove around the base of that post that that spring sits into. Now if I pull that spring back, it'll typically lodge against the lens tube in the centre, and it'll allow me to fit the blade actuating ring, the B lever. So to fit the B lever, first I want to bring the shutter into the blade's open position, so I hold back this tab with my toothpick here, push the blade actuating ring around. That brings it into the blade's open position and will allow the B lever to drop down into position. There's a small groove on the back of the B lever, has to pick up that spring. So I slide that into position. The spring is dropped into the groove in that lever, and the B lever is allowed to drop close to the lens tube in the centre, so that's all fine. And the B lever is held in place with a screw here that has a spring on it. Now it's a return spring for the setting lever for the flash sync and self timer. So getting this in place is tricky because the spring wants to push it away from where I want to be. Basically I can get that in place, check that the B lever moves, and it does, and swing the tail of this spring around 180 degrees against the lens tube here. So now it's against this lever at this point. And if I hold the B lever back with my finger, I can draw the blade actuating ring back into the park position. The B lever, you can see there, is moving freely, and the spring tension is against this little catch here. There's the B lever, there's the little catch. That catch holds the shutter, stops the shutter from moving when the self timer has been set until the self timer has run down. Right, I'm going to have to change the battery on my video camera now, so back shortly.